What if everything you believe about one of the greatest love stories in literature is actually wrong, not because the story is false, but because the meaning you were taught to see is incomplete? And what if the real story was never about two people falling in love at all? It begins with a simple distortion in perception. Elizabeth Bennet thinks she understands the world. She categorizes people quickly, sharply, almost like a mental survival instinct. Darcy, in turn, carries himself like someone who has already decided how the world should interpret him. Two minds, both highly intelligent, both convinced they are seeing clearly, yet neither is actually seeing reality. But here's the question that destabilizes everything. How can two people be so rational, and still construct completely false versions of each other? Because this is not just misunderstanding. This is cognitive architecture failure. A system-level illusion. And it begins long before either of them realizes it. At first, it looks like social tension. Class difference. Pride. Reputation. But underneath that surface layer, something far more unstable is forming. Every interaction between Elizabeth and Darcy is not building connection, it is reinforcing ego structure. Every judgment, every rejection, every assumption becomes a brick in a psychological wall either of them can see. And the more intelligent they are, the more refined that wall becomes. Here's the contradiction: intelligence doesn't dissolve illusion. It perfects it. Elizabeth believes she is discerning truth, but what she is actually refining is a bias so precise it feels like clarity. Darcy believes he is maintaining dignity, but what he is actually protecting is a fragile internal hierarchy that cannot survive misinterpretation. Two ecosystems, running in parallel, both optimize for self-protection rather than truth recognition. And then something shifts. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But structurally. A single piece of information enters the system, something that does not match either of their internal models. A memory fragment moment. A fracture point. And instead of adjusting slightly, their entire perception grid begins to destabilize. Because when identity is built on interpretation, even small corrections feel like existential threats. What if the problem was never that they misunderstood each other, but that they needed the misunderstanding in order to maintain who they thought they were? Think about the consequence of that. If Elizabeth sees Darcy correctly too early, she loses the version of herself that believes she is perceptive. If Darcy is understood too quickly, he loses the structure that gives him control. So in a strange way, misunderstanding is not a failure, it is functional. It preserves identity. And that leads to a disturbing question. If their identities depend on misreading each other, then what exactly would truth destroy? Because every step toward clarity is also a step toward ego dissolution. Every correction removes a layer of who they thought they were. And neither of them is prepared for that loss yet. This is where the deeper mechanism reveals itself. What we call love in this system is not the beginning of connection. It is the aftermath of identity collapse. The moment when the old self can no longer survive the updated perception of reality. And that raises something larger than their story. If two people cannot see each other clearly without first losing who they were, then is love actually connection, or is it controlled psychological breakdown? And if that is true, then what other stories have we been reading, without ever noticing the moment where identity quietly dies in order for meaning to be reborn? The deeper you go into this relationship, the more unsettling the question becomes. Are Elizabeth and Darcy actually discovering each other, or are they just discovering how fragile their own identities really are? Because something important is happening beneath every interaction now. Not visible on the surface, but structurally embedded in how they interpret reality. Elizabeth doesn't simply change her mind about Darcy. That would be too simple. What actually shifts is the entire framework she uses to judge truth. And that raises a disturbing possibility. If your framework of judgment collapses, what exactly remains of your certainty about the world? Darcy is experiencing the same instability, but in reverse. His controlled distance from people, his carefully constructed emotional hierarchy, begins to fail under the weight of misinterpretation. Not because others suddenly become clearer, but because he starts noticing the gap between how he intends to be seen and how he is actually perceived. And that gap is not social, it is existential. Here's the contradiction: the more they attempt to define each other, the less stable their own identities become. A memory fragment emerges here, small but irreversible. A moment where a statement, a letter, a reaction disrupts the internal model each of them has built. Not as drama, but as cognitive rupture. And once that rupture happens, the mind has only two options: reject the new information, or reconstruct the self around it. Neither option is painless. Elizabeth begins to experience something unfamiliar, doubt not about Darcy, but about her ability to interpret people at all. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once perception itself becomes questionable, judgment loses authority. And when judgment loses authority, identity begins to float without anchor. Scales shift. This is no longer about two individuals misreading each other. It is about how human beings construct reality through selective perception, and how easily that reality collapses when confronted with inconsistency. Darcy, meanwhile, is undergoing a quieter but more dangerous transformation. He starts to realize that control over social perception does not equal control over truth. People are not responding to who he is, but to what they believe he represents. And that representation is not stable. It fractures under misunderstanding, admiration, resentment, distance. Each reaction reshapes him in ways he cannot fully predict. So now the question deepens: if identity is partly built through the reflections of others, what happens when those reflections are wrong? Contradiction emerges again, because what appears as emotional conflict is actually structural dependency. Elizabeth needs Darcy to be wrong in order to preserve her certainty. Darcy needs Elizabeth to misunderstand him in order to maintain control. Misperception is not an accident here. It is a stabilizer. A psychological equilibrium disguised as conflict. And then the system begins to fail. A revelation starts forming in fragments rather than moments. The realization that neither of them is interacting with the other directly, they are interacting with interpretations of interpretations. Layers of cognitive projection stack so tightly that truth becomes almost irrelevant to the structure itself. And this is where the emotional weight increases. Because if perception is always mediated, then even understanding someone might just mean replacing one illusion with a more acceptable one. What does that mean for the idea of love? Consequence becomes unavoidable. If love is built on revised perception rather than direct truth, then every relationship is partially constructed from error, refined, corrected, but never fully real in the way we assume. And yet, the most unsettling part remains unresolved. Because as their perceptions begin to crack, something else begins to emerge, not clarity, but transformation. A version of self that can only exist after previous certainty dissolves. So the question becomes heavier, sharper, more irreversible. If every step toward truth requires the destruction of who you thought you were, then is identity something we discover, or something we continuously lose in order to keep seeing at all? The most dangerous moment in any system of belief is not when it is proven false, but when it starts to explain its own contradictions. Because that is exactly where everything shifts now. Elizabeth is no longer simply questioning Darcy, and Darcy is no longer simply reacting to Elizabeth. Something larger is happening underneath them, an invisible restructuring of how meaning itself is constructed between two people who believe they are thinking independently. But here is the question that now emerges: if both perception and interpretation are unstable, what part of the self is actually making decisions? The answer is not simple, because neither of them is operating from a single unified identity anymore. Elizabeth is beginning to split her own certainty into fragments: what she thought she knew, what she now suspects, and what she refuses to accept. Darcy, on the other hand, is no longer defending his image. He is defending the system that created his image in the first place. And that difference changes everything. Memory fragment, a single moment of realization that one interpretation was wrong, not slightly inaccurate, but structurally false. That kind of correction does not just update information. It forces a rebuild of the internal hierarchy of judgment. And once that hierarchy collapses, there is no neutral ground left. Now the escalation begins. Elizabeth starts noticing something unsettling. Her strongest judgments about people are often formed before evidence arrives, not after. This is not about Darcy anymore. This is about how quickly certainty can form without truth. And once that realization enters, it contaminates every previous assumption she has ever made about anyone. Scales shift. What began as a romantic misalignment is now revealing itself as a cognitive architecture problem. Human beings do not see reality. They negotiate it internally using incomplete emotional data and social projection. Darcy is undergoing a parallel destabilization. His sense of identity was never fully personal. It was structural, built on how society responds to status, behavior, and silence. But now he is discovering something more uncomfortable. Even authority is a form of interpretation. It only exists as long as others agree to recognize it. And here comes the contradiction that cannot be resolved easily. The more control he exerts over perception, the less control he has over truth. Because truth does not respond to social positioning. It responds to exposure. A second memory fragment appears here, subtle but irreversible. A moment where intent and perception diverge so sharply that neither can correct the other. Not because communication fails, but because meaning itself is unstable between sender and receiver. Now the system begins to fracture at a deeper level. Elizabeth is no longer just re-evaluating Darcy. She is re-evaluating the concept of evaluation itself. If judgment can be this wrong, this confidently wrong, then what does intelligence actually measure? And more dangerously, what does it fail to detect? Darcy, in contrast, is facing a quieter collapse. He begins to realize that being misunderstood is not a temporary social error, it is a permanent condition of human interaction. No one is ever fully seen, only approximated. And every approximation changes depending on who is observing. Consequence emerges clearly now. If identity depends on external reflection, and those reflections are always distorted, then identity itself is not stable. It is continuously reconstructed through error. And this leads to a deeper cognitive rupture. Because what they are both approaching, without yet fully seeing, is the possibility that the relationship between them is not built on misunderstanding at all. It is built on something more fundamental, the necessity of misunderstanding in order for transformation to occur. But that idea is still incomplete, still unstable, still forming. And so the final question rises, heavier than before, refusing closure. If every moment of clarity requires the destruction of a previous self, then is understanding another person actually an act of connection, or is it the slow and irreversible dissolution of everything you believed was you? The deeper this structure unfolds, the more it stops feeling like a story about two people, and starts resembling a system revealing how human perception actually constructs reality itself. Because at this point, something irreversible has happened in the logic beneath Elizabeth and Darcy. The question is no longer what they think of each other. The question is why any stable identity can exist at all when every perception is filtered through incomplete interpretation. And that is where the revelation begins to surface, not as a statement, but as a structural shift in understanding. What if neither Elizabeth nor Darcy ever had access to each other as individuals in the first place? Revelation, they only ever interacted with projections generated by their own cognitive systems. Not lies, not deception, but structured approximations built from social expectation, emotional bias, and incomplete signals. And the terrifying part is not that these projections exist, but that they are indistinguishable from reality during the moment they are believed. This is the hidden mechanism underneath everything. Elizabeth's judgment is not simply flawed, it is predictive. Her mind constructs meaning before confirmation arrives. Darcy's composure is not simply pride, it is a defensive architecture designed to prevent misinterpretation from destabilizing identity. Both are not reacting to truth. They are reacting to internal models of truth that evolve independently of reality itself. Memory fragment, a moment where one sentence, one gesture, or one written clarification does not correct misunderstanding, but replaces one illusion with a more sophisticated illusion that feels closer to truth, yet remains structurally artificial. And now the insight deepens. Perception is not a window. It is a negotiation engine. Every human interaction is processed through layers of expectation, memory, and social encoding before meaning is finalized. By the time understanding is formed, reality has already been reconstructed. Consequently, what appears as romantic development between Elizabeth and Darcy is actually a progressive collapse of these internal models. Each correction is not addition, but subtraction. Each realization removes certainty rather than adding clarity. And what remains after each collapse is not truth, it is adaptability. Scales shift. This is no longer about individual psychology. It is about how societies maintain coherence despite never sharing identical perception of reality. Entire social structures depend on the assumption that misinterpretation is manageable, even necessary, for continuity. Darcy begins to represent something larger than himself here. He is not just a man misread by one person. He is a symbol of how identity depends on being consistently misinterpreted in predictable ways. Elizabeth is not just correcting her view of him. She is dismantling the mechanism by which certainty itself is constructed. And here lies the quiet rupture. If perception is always reconstructed, then truth is never directly accessed, only approximated through repeated correction. Meaning exists not in accuracy, but in iteration. Memory fragment. A single emotional realization that what felt like certainty in one moment becomes unrecognizable after new context is introduced, without any change in external reality. So the revelation expands further. The connection forming between Elizabeth and Darcy is not a convergence of understanding. It is the synchronized breakdown of two separate interpretive systems. They are not meeting in truth. They are meeting in instability. And this changes everything about what transformation actually means. Because if identity only becomes visible during its own collapse, then stability is not the sign of truth, it is the sign of untested illusion. And collapse is not failure, it is exposure. But this leads to a deeper and more unsettling realization still forming beneath the surface. If every meaningful relationship requires the destruction of the self that enters it, then what exactly is preserved after understanding is achieved? The real question is not how two people misunderstand each other, but why misunderstanding is so deeply embedded in the structure of human connection that removing it would collapse the entire system we call identity. Because at this stage, everything that seemed like relationship dynamics between Elizabeth and Darcy begins to resolve into something far more fundamental. Not romance. Not conflict. But a cognitive architecture that governs how human beings stabilize meaning in an unstable world. Core revelation: identity does not exist as a fixed entity inside the mind. It exists as a continuously updated prediction model maintained through interaction with other minds. Elizabeth is not Elizabeth in isolation. Darcy is not Darcy in isolation. They are both living outputs of feedback loops. Systems that only remain coherent because other people consistently misinterpret them in familiar ways. And the moment this system becomes too accurate, something paradoxical happens: identity begins to dissolve. Memory fragment. A single moment of recognition where being correctly understood feels less like validation and more like disappearance, as if the self has no structure without interpretive friction. This is the hidden architecture beneath every exchange they have ever had. Elizabeth's sharp perception is not just intelligence, it is a stabilizing force that organizes uncertainty into categories. Darcy's emotional restraint is not just pride, it is a containment system designed to prevent external interpretation from rewriting internal structure too quickly. Both are maintaining identity not through truth, but through controlled distortion. Insight expansion, what they call growth, is not accumulation of truth, but progressive loss of stable self-models that can no longer survive updated perception. Every correction is not addition. It is replacement. And what replaces it is never final. And this is where the structure reveals its deeper consequence. Because if identity is built through interpretive friction, then perfect understanding is not harmony. It is erasure. A completely transparent perception between two individuals would eliminate the interpretive space required for self-continuity. In other words, absolute clarity does not connect people, it dissolves them. Darcy begins to represent the paradox of social legibility. The more clearly he is seen, the less coherent his internal identity becomes. Elizabeth becomes the mechanism through which certainty is deconstructed. Not intentionally, but structurally. Her corrections do not just change him, they remove the version of him that required being misunderstood to exist. Scale shift. This is no longer about two individuals navigating emotion. This is about how civilizations maintain psychological stability through controlled misalignment of perception. Societies do not function because everyone understands each other accurately. They function because everyone operates within acceptable ranges of misunderstanding. Memory fragment. A moment where recognition arrives too precisely, stripping away ambiguity, leaving behind not clarity, but a strange void where identity used to feel stable. So the core revelation completes its structure. What appears as romantic resolution is actually a controlled collapse of interpretive identities into a shared but unstable awareness. They do not become one through love. They become less individually definable through mutual perception correction. And here is the deepest inversion. What feels like emotional connection is actually the reduction of psychological boundaries that previously kept identity intact. Consequently, the meaning of their transformation is not that they finally see each other clearly. It is that they survive the loss of the versions of themselves that depended on not being seen clearly. Philosophical consequence. If identity requires interpretive distortion to remain stable, then every act of understanding another person is simultaneously an act of erasing the conditions that made that identity possible in the first place. And this leads into the final unresolved fracture. If clarity dismantles the self, then is human connection something we pursue to find truth, or something we endure while the self quietly disappears into it? The moment this system fully reveals itself, the story of Elizabeth and Darcy stops being about what they gained, and becomes about what they permanently lost in order to gain it. Because at this stage, the consequence is no longer theoretical. It is structural. Every layer of understanding they have reached has required the removal of a previous layer of self-certainty. And what remains is not a stable identity, but a continuous process of reconstruction that never returns to its original form. What they have paid for clarity is not confusion. It is permanence. Expansion. Once perception becomes recursive, once you begin to question not just what you see, but how you see, there is no return to innocence of interpretation. Elizabeth cannot unlearn the fragility of her judgment. Darcy cannot unsee the instability of his social identity. Every future interaction is now contaminated by awareness of how easily meaning can collapse under revised context. Memory fragment. A silent realization that even the most confident belief may only be the final stabilized version of a long chain of earlier misreadings. And this is where legacy begins to form, not as resolution, but as aftereffect. The legacy of their transformation is not that they became better at understanding each other. It is that they permanently altered what understanding means. The relationship no longer functions as a destination of emotional clarity. It becomes a demonstration that clarity itself is unstable, and that identity only survives through selective blindness. Scale shift. What happens between Elizabeth and Darcy is not unique to them. It reflects a broader pattern embedded in human cognition itself. Every society, every relationship, every system of belief depends on controlled gaps in perception. Without those gaps, coherence collapses faster than truth can stabilize. Darcy's influence, in this sense, extends beyond his personal transformation. He becomes a representation of how identity built on reputation is always dependent on being partially misread. Elizabeth becomes a representation of how intelligence without awareness of bias can reinforce illusion rather than dismantle it. Together, they expose a system in which misunderstanding is not an error, but a functional requirement for psychological continuity. Memory fragment. The moment when a corrected belief does not bring relief, but instead creates a subtle disorientation, as if the mind has lost a reference point it did not know it was relying on. And this is the deeper consequence. Once a person becomes aware that identity is constructed through interpretive instability, every attempt to stabilize meaning becomes provisional. Nothing can be fully final again. Every conclusion carries the shadow of possible revision. This is not liberation. It is cognitive responsibility. Because now, even love is no longer exempt from structural doubt. If emotional connection is built through evolving perception, then it is always partially dependent on error correction, not absolute truth. And that means every moment of intimacy carries within it the possibility of reinterpretation that can reshape what it means entirely. So the legacy of this transformation is not emotional fulfillment. It is epistemic instability embedded into the way meaning itself is experienced. And that leads to the final reflection emerging from this structure. If every stable version of the self is only temporary, sustained by selective misperception, then what exactly is a human being when there is no longer any stable illusion left to hold them together? What remains when everything you believed about understanding another person has been slowly stripped away, layer by layer, until nothing stable is left except the awareness that stability itself was never real? Final insight, the deepest truth revealed through Elizabeth and Darcy is not that humans misunderstand each other, but that misunderstanding is the invisible structure that allows identity to exist at all. Not as a flaw, but as a stabilizing illusion. Every person is held together by a network of partial interpretations, of themselves, of others, of meaning itself. Remove those distortions, and what you get is not clarity. What you get is dissolution. And yet, something unexpected survives this collapse. Not certainty. Not perfect knowledge. But the capacity to continue forming meaning even when meaning is known to be unstable. Memory fragment, a moment when a belief no longer feels true, yet still shapes behavior, as if the mind has accepted that truth is not a destination, but a constantly shifting negotiation. Legacy, what this story ultimately leaves behind is not a lesson about love, but a warning about perception. Every human bond exists inside a fragile architecture of assumptions that must remain slightly incomplete in order to function. Too much accuracy destroys coherence. Too much clarity removes the space where identity can breathe. And yet without the pursuit of clarity, there is no evolution, no transformation, no becoming. Elizabeth and Darcy, in this sense, are not characters reaching emotional fulfillment. They are two cognitive systems passing through controlled collapse. What survives is not who they were, but what they became after their certainty could no longer support itself. And that afterstate is neither victory nor failure. It is adaptation under pressure from truth that cannot be fully held. Human meaning, this is why the story continues to matter. Not because it resolves love, but because it exposes the hidden cost of knowing. In modern life, where perception is constantly filtered, corrected, and reconstructed through countless invisible systems, the same pattern repeats at scale. Every relationship, every identity, every self-image depends on selective blindness to remain coherent. Memory fragment, the realization that even the most intimate understanding of another person still leaves something unreachable, not because it is hidden, but because total access would erase the structure that makes recognition possible. So what remains is not certainty about others, but a redefinition of what connection actually is. It is not the elimination of distance. It is the negotiation of distance without collapse. A balance between seeing and not seeing, between knowing and preserving the conditions that make knowing sustainable. And this leads into the final reflection that cannot be fully closed, only carried forward. If every form of understanding reshapes the thing being understood, and every form of clarity changes the observer as much as the observed, then what we call truth may not be something we arrive at all, but something that only exists in the fragile space between two minds that are still becoming, still shifting, still unfinished. And in that space, the question never really ends. It only continues to evolve. What does it mean to truly see another person, if seeing them clearly also means they may no longer be the same afterward, and neither are you?